Welcome back to the Freight Podcast. My name is Austin Gregory, and I'm your host. And on today's episode, I want us to do a deep dive. Now, what I mean by that is we've been doing a hot take series. We've been doing the Daniel series. And a lot of that, at the bare minimum, has just an outline. But this episode is going to be a little bit more focused. And what that means is I need you to pay a little bit more of attention to some of the details and the topic of discussion for today. I want us to talk about our feelings about immigration and specifically how it may expose us for who we actually are. Now, growing up, I was taught the good American work ethic, the type of work ethic that made men do hard things early in the morning, the type of work ethic that made you finish a job before you left, or the type of work ethic that made the older men in the community smile and feel like maybe the world does still have some good men out there. But this work ethic was taught by way of teaching us in a grounded context what a meritocracy is. Now, a meritocracy is the social fabric America was claimed to be built on. And it's the structure of a society that believes a person's status, whether this is financial or in class or in terms of power, can be achieved or harmed based on a person's merit. And merit is just their personal ability to attain those things. Now, you may have learned this as a child, this idea of meritocracy. You met a kid at school who had an allowance given to him by his parents, and so you use common sense and make the connection for yourself. You have this equation. My parents plus me equals I get paid. You then, being the smart child you are, go to your parents one day in the kitchen and you tell them, hey, Carter gets an allowance and I think I should too. Your parents respond by first laughing in your face and then proceeding to quiz you on why exactly you believe you should get paid for existing. Now, your parents and you eventually work out an agreement, and if you can do a few extra chores around the house every week, then you can get $5. You agree. The lesson you just learned in that instance was that in the family structure you exist in order to get what you want, you had to earn it. And many of us were taught the same lesson in a variety of ways. And a lot of what I believe is a good American spirit in our country is one that causes us to be a bit of a dreamer and a bit of a pragmatist at the same time. Meaning, because of the uniqueness of our country and the messaging we have communicated to us from a very young age, we are all encouraged to dream big. Become whatever we want to be. And we're told to not just dream it, but to make it happen. To do the hard work, give the time, and be consistent, and eventually your dreams will likely pay off. But there is a conversation that's been happening more recently that I believe exposes that as Americans, we maybe don't always believe in a meritocracy. And our way of dodging our hypocrisy is about attacking people based on a part of their identity that they simply cannot control. Let's shift to immigration and H1B visas. Now, immigration is the process individuals from foreign countries go through to migrate or move from their homeland, specifically in this case into ours. And there's a legal process that they should submit to. This legal process keeps track of how many citizens we have in our country and what we're getting into with letting this certain individual in. But the process has been broken for quite some time. And it's really easy to make blanket statements that if you came across illegally, you should not be allowed to stay here. But blanket statements often miss in reality. I watched in real time as a cousin of mine who was brought here shortly after her birth illegally fought to gain citizenship. It really didn't matter how many people we had in her corner because the process still sucked. It was not her fault. Her whole life she lived as an American, that's all she knew. Yet, for many people, the fact that she was illegal, devoid of her trying to become legal, meant that she was a problem. This messaging was going to be communicated to her time and time again. So imagine with me what that does to a child who, based on their identity, based on who they are as a person, they will always be treated as unwelcome. Their title from a very early age, think 2 years old, is that they are a crime. Now, there's a ton of nuance we could parse out, but the reality is immigration is a human problem. At least, as Christians, it should be. There's no reason we cannot have walls or a legal process as a country. That's what countries do. But what Christians do is not always in line with the country's objective. We have two different goals. And as a Christian first, when we approach this conversation, we have to be smart, and we have to be diligent, and we have to understand there are real people who are affected by the outcomes of this conversation. And despite the recent trend to say empathy is a sin, being a cold-hearted, unloving, inhospitable follower of Jesus is also a sin. So, claiming one ditch as you abandon another does not make you righteous. It makes you a human. And as a human who follows in the way of Jesus, the aim is always to repent of our mistakes and course correct where we need to. The road is narrow, meaning those ditches are close, and they're easy to fall into. So we have to beware. Now, as we shift our focus back to this idea of a meritocracy, where individuals can either pave the way for their success or demise, the reason this idea of a merit-based system is so important to the immigration conversation is because up until recently, that's exactly how this conversation went. For decades, immigrants were told they did not deserve handouts, and much of the pushback for why immigrants should not come to America was because they were coming expecting a handout. The critique was that people from all these other third world-like nations seeing the richness America had to offer and wanted to exploit it. But then something interesting happened. Those immigrants were not getting the handouts. They were working hard, in some cases even harder than the natural-born citizens, and many of these immigrants took more pride in the U.S. than the people who had lived here for generations. What actually ended up happening was many immigrants seeing the supposed bar or standard America had for them, and they rose to the occasion. These people had come from countries where moving to America cost them family ties, cost them education status, cost them economic stability, and were willing to risk it all, put in the hard work, and prove themselves in the merit-based system that they too belonged here. But here comes the next problem for our foreign neighbors. There's this program for immigrants that they can apply for. And essentially, these potential immigrants play the lottery on getting picked to be a part of the American workforce. This program grants you an H1B visa, giving you permission based on your resume to come to the States and work. More recently, this program has been coming under pressure from the current administration. The argument is that these immigrants coming here through the H1B visa program are stealing American jobs from American people. And there is a specific argument made against this program, particularly because of the large percentage of these H1B visas that are granted to people from India. Now, we supposedly live in a culture where 79% of people are largely for immigration, according to a Gallup poll conducted in 2025. The perceived backlash against immigration is because people are coming in who do not respect their country or hold to the same values or freeloading. The Gallup study also highlights that the increased interest and positive views on immigration were previously lower due to rising concerns based on Biden's border influx. But since Trump's administration's very aggressive stance, many people have swung back to a more positive view on immigration. But just in the case of the H-1B visas, the positive stances come under scrutiny. The people applying for H-1Bs work above and beyond hard to even get a chance at hitting this immigration lottery. Their visa is dependent on their work. The very fact that they are coming over here is largely attributed to the respect they have for our country, and they tend to be pretty conservative. So what this ends up posing as a question for us is, why has the news and the current administration made immigration such a top-of-the-line topic of conversation in our politics? My guess is that it's because the elites fail to see the people they claim to serve as real people. Real people can be moved by the words of another. And when you keep making claims that there's this influx of people coming in who hate you, and they want to poison your country in order to see its demise, then obviously, with that argument, you're going to start going on the defense. This method of rhetoric is called dehumanizing. When you dehumanize, you take the humanity away from another person, or you go one step further and demonize, which means you attribute the worst intentions to that person. And with this, you had the perfect recipe for conjuring up a worthy enemy to rally people to fight against. The problem is, as Christians, Jesus' way of dealing with our enemies is not the way the current administration would have you deal with your enemies. And as Christians, there's clear instructions on how you are to deal with outsiders, people from foreign lands. My aim is not to break down immigration law. I'm not a politician or a legal expert, and frankly, neither are you. Well, probably. But I do have a pastor's heart, and I have an urge to follow Jesus in every sphere of my life, meaning nothing is out of limits, nothing's out of bounds. And with both of those combined, I feel the need to speak into this area and at the least set a foundation for how Christians in this country should approach the immigration conversation. So let's take a look at the multi-ethnic kingdom of foreigners. The family of God starts off with a clear breaking of ties. Yahweh, the God of the Bible, calls Abram, the father of the big three religions, to go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you, from Genesis 12:1. Now, this language of leaving everything you know can be easily glossed over when we take the humanity and real-world circumstances out of our reading of the Bible. But this is a clear example of God doing this work of pulling people away from what they've always known to a life with God. Abram is not the first example of an immigrant in the Bible, but he is an immigrant by the call of God to leave his land and his family in order to go to another land. Our faith system is built on a historical figure who understood the immigrant's journey. Now, you may feel tense at this moment as I call Abram an immigrant. You may feel like, Austin, you're just using woke language to prove a point. But I'm not. An immigrant, as we mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, is someone who leaves their land to move to another. That's not a woke term, that's just a term. This is exactly what Abraham is called by God to do, and the Bible picks this theme up again later in the New Testament. The author of Hebrews plays on this theme of the people of God living in a place that is not their home. In Hebrews 13:14, it says, "For this world is not our permanent home. We are looking forward to a home yet to come." The author of Hebrews is highlighting this experience that many people go through being a pilgrim, a traveler of lands, a person on a journey from one destination to the next to describe what the experience of a follower of Jesus is like in this world. Going from Eden to the city of God. This immigration story is closely tied to the story of our faith, because our faith was demonstrated throughout the pages of Scripture by people who were living in the margins of their world. Our Bibles are not birthed from a place of privilege, though you will see examples of privilege throughout the pages. Our faith comes from people who were often cast out, overlooked, discarded as lesser than. But this is the very people God will bring into his family. When Abram is called by God, God promises him a family. God makes a covenant to install Abraham as a father of many nations, more numerous than the stars, and the way that happens is not through bloodline, but rather through the open-ended table that God sets up through the line of Abraham by way of Jesus Christ. And we see glimpses of God building this family of his through the line of Abraham by showing grace to the outsider or welcoming in the stranger. And early on in Abraham's covenant relationship with Yahweh, they said this practice of circumcision. This practice was unique to the family of Abraham. It set them apart from the world around them by giving this outward sign of this covenant Abraham and his family would have with God. In Genesis 17, Yahweh approaches 90-year-old Abram and says, "I will set up my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you greatly." It's in Genesis 17:2. Expansion of Abraham's family is in sight. This covenant was never meant to be isolated or small, but instead it would be distinct and growing. And that line, "multiply you greatly," signifies that the kind of growth that will happen with Abram's family is not going to be in the way people would ever expect. So Yahweh continues his declaration of this covenant with Abram in the following verses. In Genesis 17:4-7, the text says, "As for me, here's my covenant with you. You will become the father of many nations. You will no longer be Abram. Your name will be Abraham. For I will make you the father of many nations. I will make you extremely fruitful, and will make nations and kings come from you. I will confirm my covenant that is between me and you and your future offspring throughout their generations." Now, Vince Vantu in his book, Multitude of All People, speaks about why Constantine and the Roman Empire wanted to adopt Christianity. And he makes this argument that the reason why was because Constantine wanted to broaden his reach. Vince says, "One of the most appealing facets of Christianity was its universal appeal." End quote. Christianity, from its very conception, now I'm not talking about the Jesus movement, was built on Yahweh identifying a certain people as his own in order to reach widely. And where most religions will focus on a certain tribe, Yahweh sets the vision early on that this relationship he is building with humanity is one that will transcend cultural barriers and ethnic lines. So what better way to do this than by calling an immigrant? Someone who can understand living in a land not their own. Someone who can move to begin this work of building a multi-ethnic kingdom. Now Yahweh does not just stop there, though, by casting a vision for Abram, now turned Abraham. Instead, Yahweh gives instructions to Abram about how to begin building this diverse family of God. As for you and your offspring after you throughout their generations are to keep my covenant. This is my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you, which you are to keep. Every one of your males must be circumcised. You must circumcise the flesh of your foreskin to serve as a sign of the covenant between me and you. And throughout your generations, every male among you is to be circumcised at 8 days old, every male born in your household or purchased from any foreigner and not your offspring. Whether born in your household or purchased, he must be circumcised. My covenant will be marked in your flesh as a permanent covenant. And if any male is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that man will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. That is from Genesis 17:9-14. Now, Abraham's covenant with Yahweh will not only include his offspring, but also the foreigners living within his or his children's household. And these foreigners will be adopted into the family of God. And though the ramifications of this adoption will not be seen right away, it will have a transformative effect on the issue like slavery for generations to come. In fact, this is why in the New Testament, Paul writes a letter to a slave owner named Philemon about his runaway slave, named Onesimus, who had just experienced the life change of the gospel. Paul sends this runaway back to his master, which may sound problematic to our modern ears at first, but it's only until you hear how Paul instructs Philemon to deal with his runaway slave. Paul in his letter, in Philemon 12 through 16, says, I am sending him, talking about Onesimus, who is my very heart, back to you. I would have liked to keep him with me so that he could take your place in helping me while I'm in chains for the gospel, but I did not want to do anything without your consent, so that any favor you do would not seem forced but would be voluntary. Perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. He is very dear to me, but even dearer to you, both as a fellow man and as a brother in the Lord. So, what we see there is that the gospel changes our relationships with others in a way that flips the social orders that we live in upside down. And once Onesimus becomes a brother to Philemon, the relationship has to change. You don't keep a brother in chains. You invite him to the table. You work alongside of him, not over him. Paul is inviting the slave owner to not only embrace the gospel effect on Onesimus, but to also let that gospel affect himself, Philemon, as well. This is why, again, Paul the Apostle has this line in his letter to the church of Galatia. In this letter, Paul is writing to a church who is being divided on ethnic lines, Jew versus Gentile, and Paul will not have it be so. Paul says in Galatians 3:26 through 29, So in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Paul brings the work Jesus has done at making Jews and Gentiles children of God in connection to that covenant we seen earlier that Yahweh made with Abraham. Paul specifically says that these Jew and Gentile believers are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. And what we're seeing here is the broadening of the kingdom, reaching some fulfillment, but not all. We will not see all until this image in Revelation 7:9 appears of people of all tribes, tongues, and nations gathered together as a united family of God. But we do see this theme of Yahweh instructing in himself, welcoming the outsider into the family. In Leviticus 19, in a weird mix of rules that Yahweh is giving to his newly formed people coming out of their time in Egypt, he says, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, don't mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. That's from Leviticus 19, verses 33 through 34. Tony Evans, commentating on this passage, says, when the Lord commanded his people to love their neighbor as themselves, that included the alien as well as the native born among them. They were to love them, for once the Israelites were aliens in the land of Egypt. Therefore they were to consider the foreign-born peoples among them as their own brothers and sisters and treat them accordingly. End quote. Rich Perez, in his book Mikasa Uptown, writes about this love thy neighbor type of hospitality we're supposed to demonstrate as believers to these outsiders. And after quoting Romans 12:13, which says, seek to show hospitality, Perez continues by defining what this word hospitality means. Perez says, the word hospitality is made up of two Greek words. The first is philo, which means deep sibling-like love. The second word is xeno, which means stranger. That's where we get the word xenophobia, the fear of strangers. So when God is thinking of hospitality, the first person he has in mind is not our friend or people with whom we are familiar. He's thinking of the stranger, the person with whom we are not familiar. End quote. Matt Chandler adds a little more helpful insight into what this type of hospitality the Bible speaks of looks like in his book Take Heart. Chandler says, hospitality is to give loving welcome to those outside of your normal circle of friends. It's an opening your life and your home to those who believe differently than you do. Make dinner with these people whom God has placed near you a priority. Invite them into your life so that you might know them. Engage them, love them, serve them, and walk alongside them through a broken and shattered world, witnessing to them of the love of the one who died to invite them to his table. End quote. Jesus gives us the best examples of what this type of hospitality looks like that welcomes the stranger or the enemies in our lives to the table. In John 4, we have a story about Jesus purposefully going through Samaria to get to Jerusalem. And while he is in Samaria, Jesus runs into a Samaritan woman at a well. Now, many of us, when we have heard the story told in church, find ourselves being told to focus on the sins of this woman as being the start point of the story. But another layer to the story that often goes overlooked is the Samaritan Jew clash that is also taking place. Jews and Samaritans don't live peacefully. In fact, it was seen as very dangerous for a Jew to walk through Samaria, not only because Samaritans were seen as unclean, especially women, but because Samaritans were seen as the enemy, someone not to be trusted. The very idea of Jesus, a Jewish man, voluntarily walking through the city of Samaria and even staying there for 2 days, like mentioned in John 4:40, was unheard of. But then again, this was the mission all along. The mission God established for his people in Genesis with Abraham was that through Abraham, the family of God would be a blessing to all nations. So the way Yahweh uses Abraham's family to be that blessing is by raising up this king who understands living in a land not your own. Not only was Jesus the Son of God incarnated as a human man 2,000 plus years ago, but Jesus and his family have also had to leave their homeland in order to survive. Matthew records this narrative of a young Jesus and his family fleeing for safety in Egypt because of Herod's quest to kill any potential king being raised up among the Jews. Jesus, in modern terms, is what we would call a refugee. A refugee is someone who is fleeing for safety from their homeland into another. And this is not a voluntary removal. This is an act of desperation. This is what happens when a dad sees the danger coming to his family and seeks to fulfill his role as a protector. Jesus understands living in a land not your own because he had no other option. But he's not the only one. Thomas Oden writes in his book, The African Memory Mark, that John Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark, was an immigrant from Africa. John Mark's family were Jews from Cyrene, which is Upper Africa, of the tribe of Levi. And originally they were from Palestine, but during the wars of the Maccabees, many Jews dispersed for safety concerns and landed in 2 specific places. Those 2 being Alexandria and Cyrene. John Mark's family landed in Cyrene. They still held onto their Jewish heritage, but they were African Jews, meaning for John Mark, he understood again this feeling of living in a land not your own. John Mark would go on, along with his mother, to be some of Jesus' first followers and to write the oldest of the Gospels. In fact, Matthew and Luke are credited as pulling a lot from John Mark's telling of the life of Jesus. And later on, after Jesus' resurrection, John Mark would find his way back to Africa to share the good news of this multi-ethnic kingdom in such a way that St. John Mark is a pillar to the continent of Africa today. The first Christian school was established because of John Mark's efforts. The list could go on and on. Let me quickly highlight, in as brief as I can, a few other notable mentions to help you see who these characters in our Bibles actually are. The first one is in Genesis 37 through 50. We see this man named Joseph, who is an abandoned brother, turned slave, turned prisoner of the Pharaoh, but eventually helps his family migrate to Egypt. Again, modern day. We're talking about the continent of Africa, because of his eventual status in the land. The second example is the Israelites, who have lived in Egypt for 400 years by the time Moses comes onto the scene. Note, that's longer than America has been a country, so this is largely just home for them now. But when God calls Moses to lead his people out of slavery in Egypt to the Promised Land, we are talking about a very large people group migrating from one land to another. And the Israelites categorically fit the description of what a refugee is. The Israelites are a displaced people trapped in slavery to Pharaoh who has a history of genocide to his advantage. These are people who understood fleeing the only home they ever knew in order to live a better life somewhere else. The third example is Ruth, who is from the land of Moab, meaning she's a Gentile, and she moves in with her former mother-in-law Naomi back to Naomi's homeland, which is in Bethlehem. Ruth not only was the wife of Naomi's son, meaning they had an interracial marriage, but she was a foreigner. So when she moved back with Naomi, she was the outsider. She's an immigrant in town from the land where heathens come from. Again, this list could keep going, but the point is our Bibles are full of marginalized people groups. The Bible is full of people traveling from one land to another, whether it's for safety concerns, making them a refugee, or simply God calling them to another land, making them an immigrant. The people in our Bibles are on the move. And recognizing this does not make you a liberal or woke or reading the Bible with a leftist lens. It makes you honest about who these characters were. The irony, I believe, is in how quickly we put people today and get to categories on whether they are natural-born citizens or immigrants, illegal or legal, or refugees or asylum seekers. Yet if we read our Bibles through that same lens, we would walk away with the majority of people finding their way into these categories. But my point in this piece is not just to highlight who the characters in the Bible are. It's not just to show the radical nature of the hospitality Jesus calls us to. There's actually strong words given to people, specifically God's people or other nations, based on how they treat others. So let's move to God's judgment against the unjust. In one of the 12 minor prophets, we meet the prophet Amos. In Amos, his own words describing himself, he says, "I'm not a professional prophet. and I was never trained to be one. I'm just a shepherd, and I take care of sycamore fig trees. From Amos 7:14. But during the time of Amos, Israel was doing well under the reign of Jeroboam II. Jeroboam II was this military ruler who brought a lot of wealth into the nation, but he also brought in a lot of evil. And Yahweh uses this humble prophet to call out the sins of the people around him. In Amos 2:6-8, we get a glimpse of the sin Israel has fallen into. The text says, "The people of Israel have sinned again and again, and I will not let them go unpunished. They sell honorable people for silver and poor people for a pair of sandals. They trample helpless people in the dust and shove the oppressed out of the way. Both father and son sleep with the same woman, corrupting my holy name. And at their religious festivals they lounge in clothing their debtors put up as security. In the house of their gods they drink wine bought with unjust fines." It turns out that Israel has just taken advantage of the poor. Israel, who understood the weight of being enslaved, are now selling people into slavery, and they went from being crushed under the empire to becoming the empire. What I believe is important to note is that God has a specific care for the people on the margins. He judges nations on how to treat the poor, the marginalized, and for our topic of conversation, the foreigner. In the last of 12 minor prophets in the book of Malachi, we see God judge Israel again. Israel's response is to claim that God is unjust, and that he lets evildoers rise in prosperity while they suffer for doing what is right. This sentiment, I think, is relevant to us because we have all felt that way at some point or another. In fact, some of this language, I believe, shows up in the conversation white conservatives are having right now. Many white conservatives are feeling empowered to stand up because they feel like they've been neglected by our country as a whole for a good bit of time now. As a country or culture seem to focus on the disparities targeted towards black and brown people, white conservatives have argued that they now have been overlooked. They have been cast aside. And maybe there's truth to that. It's very possible that while you're focused on putting a fire out of one house, you end up neglecting another fire starting up at the house down the road. But Yahweh's response to Israel's cry that he has been unjust is important for this conversation. Yahweh says, "Look, I'm sending my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. Then the Lord you are seeking will suddenly come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant, whom you look for so eagerly, is surely coming, says the Lord of heaven's armies." That's from Malachi 3:1. Yahweh says, essentially, don't worry, guys. You all want justice, right? Don't worry, the day of the Lord, the day of justice, is coming. And I know how eager you all have been to see that day. So just wait. But then Yahweh says something next. He continues, "But who will be able to endure it when he comes? Who will be able to stand and face him when he appears? For he will be like a blazing fire that refines metal, or like a strong soap that bleaches clothes. He will sit like a refiner of silver, burning away the dross." That's Malachi 3:2-3. The day of the Lord is coming, but who honestly will be able to get by Yahweh without confronting the injustice they have committed? Now you may feel like you've had injustice done to you. You may be right. But neglecting your responsibility to own your own injustice that you committed against another person does not validate you. It doesn't let you off the hook. How we treat others matters. And the big point I want to close this section off with is what Yahweh says next. "At that time I'll put you on trial. I am eager to witness against all sorcerers and adulterers and liars. I'll speak against those who cheat employees of their wages, who oppress widows and orphans, in order to deprive the foreigners living among you of justice. For these people do not fear me, says the Lord of heaven's armies." That's Malachi 3:5. God is going to judge Israel based on how they have treated the foreigners living among them. So question, how are we treating the foreigners living amongst us? Whether legal or not, how we treat people matters in the eyes of God. Legally, the woman caught in adultery should have been stoned to death, but Jesus tells those law lovers to check themselves first. And from older to younger, they start walking away. Grace has an interesting effect on people. We're all offered grace. We are all shown grace. We don't all realize when grace is at our door. I learned in high school that grace is getting what you do not deserve. And this definition profoundly changed my life because suddenly as a teenager I learned I could not interact with people the same way I'd always done. Grace requires me to not be so quick to pinpoint what people based on their actions deserve, and instead it pushes me to remember how the God who loved me, died for me, and raised me into newness of life is calling me to extend the same grace to others. This applies in every area of our lives, even how we view politics, and specifically how we deal with foreigners. I believe we have a prophetic witness, though. So you may be wondering, why on earth did I want to tackle a subject like this? It's because as Christians in the U.S., I sometimes get the feeling that we forgot how to live in this world but not be of it. It's hard to go against the grain when going with the grain is so easy, and it's hard to speak truth when talking points are filtered to you through the algorithm every day. But I believe as Christians we have a unique role to play in political conversations. I believe the Bible can shape our worldviews in ways we may not have realized or appreciated. And knowing how much of God's heart throughout the pages of Scripture went towards those people who would be classified as immigrants or refugees should at the least cause us to pause and be slow to speak. And if we're quick to speak about anything in these conversations, it should be that we are quick to highlight that all people, regardless of where they come from, are made in the image of God and deserve to be treated as such. We started this conversation off by breaking down the H1B visa program. The program being that the pushback against these legal immigrants is that they are taking American jobs away from American program. Making sure Americans have jobs in this economy matters. I'm for that. I'm with that. But I believe our culture, both inside and outside the church, have fallen into the trap of taking these people who are at the center of these conversations and using them as pawns for bigger schemes. We see this in the case of the talk about Haitian immigrants, eating pets that both the president and the vice president pushed. Now, there were no credible claims to back the statements our presidential leaders made, as NPR has pointed out. Links will be put in the description. What we learn from this situation is that when you want to rile people up, you have to create fear in them. And that's what's going to make people more afraid than by targeting objects that people truly care about, something like pets. Or another example is the recent treatment the current administration has been giving the Somalis in Minnesota. If you're unfamiliar, around the 1990s, Somalia was in a civil war, causing many to flee as refugees, and these Somalis found job opportunities at a meatpacking plant, and word would spread to others from that region, creating an influx of Somali immigrants in Twin Cities, Minnesota. Now, Trump has recently made this particular group a target in his crosshairs. The Somalis are practicing Muslims and have even found representation in Congress by way of, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Ilhan Omar. Now, what we end up having in this situation is rather complicated, because the Somalis are estimated to be about 80,000 in number in this area of the country, meaning that's a rather large population of a single demographic group of people from another country with arguably a religion that has not always been looked at as favorable within our own country. But questions about assimilation for these Somalis have rose to the surface, as it can be difficult, to say the least, to assimilate 80,000 people in one given area. And understandably, at that point, the culture can easily bend more to the Somalis' persuasion. But the other side of this equation is how these Somalis get represented by a president and more recently vice president who claim to represent Christian values. Rudyard Kipling has a poem titled We and They, to which his poem ends with this stanza. All good people agree, and all good people say, all nice people like us and we, and everyone else is they. But if you cross over the sea instead of over the way, you may end by, think of it, looking on we is only a sort of they. Part of tribalism is convincing ourselves and others that we all have good intentions. We are all here for a good purpose. The world would largely work right if people bent to our wills and ways. The people you have to convince yourself of in tribalism is that there is another group, another tribe who does not have good intentions, and this other group is labeled they. You only point at them. You don't get close to them. You only criticize them. You never appreciate them. In order for tribalism to work well, people have to be split up. And the quickest way to split people up is by labeling some people good, some people evil. And though we will often guard ourselves from using these explicit terms, the way sin works is that it manifests itself in sneaky ways to convince you that how you feel is not actually really wrong, as long as you don't say your true feelings out loud or in the most honest way possible. Trump has threatened to strip these Somali immigrants of their legal protections and refer to them as garbage. Trump has claimed that the Somalis are fraudulent people and that they have stole billions from our country. The irony is this is all relevant. Trump, the man who has recently made more money in his time as a president than he ever did as a businessman, is suspicious. Not to mention the shell companies he has helped his sons make a profit on at taxpayers' expense that the More Perfect Union has documented, or the crypto scams his family has pushed over, covered by the BBC. At best, we have a fraudster pointing a finger at other fraudsters, and at worst, we have a fraudster pointing fingers at a group of people who have been displaced from what was their family's homes for generations. They got jobs in the U.S. and are now being labeled as what is ruining this country, as if a single city or twins has that potential. My point in all this is to display the tactic of turning people from other places into other. This is a strategy. Rome did it with the Jews did it with Samaritans, the U.S. does it with the immigrants. The goal is all the same: power. Empires love power. Empires love control. Have you become part of the empire? One of my all-time favorite books I find myself coming back to is Scott McKnight and Cody Matchett's The Revelation for the Rest of Us. Now, this book is a commentary in the book of Revelation, and it's broken down in terms of a play. There's a playbill describing the characters you'll see throughout St. John's letter. There's a history explaining how the Bible's most controversial book was interpreted over the years. And what I believe the authors do very well is help us trace the imagery of the character of the empire throughout the pages of Scripture, and how the empire had begun making its way into the church. Hence, why John is having to write this letter to the 7 churches. The church at the time in Revelation, in the 1st century, had lost its way. They were being affected by the culture without even realizing it. The authors say this, aligning with Babylon, the empire, turned the church into an agent of empire. Put differently, the church surrendered its calling to the powers of the empire. End quote. Christians in the U.S. have historically voted differently. Not all vote Republican. Not all vote Democrat. Some vote for a third party, and some just don't vote at all. And in more recent years, the empire has convinced many Christians to get in line, to make America first priority, to buy into the empire's way of dehumanizing and deporting people made in the image of God, to declare war on these people groups, because if they do not, then the enemy will win. One of the more common lines I've been hearing is that, specifically in regards to Muslims, they are our enemies because they cannot help but to view us as their enemy. Muslims in particular have a religious reason to label us as enemies and eventually take the West out, or Christians in particular. This rhetoric has given rise to figures like Pete Hesketh, the Secretary of War, a man who looks back at the Crusades and gets tattoos honoring the bloodbath that they were as good. But what church history has taught me is that the church loses when it fights like the world. The church loses when it becomes empire. And to add on to that, Christ calls us as something profoundly different than the world. Christ's relationship with his enemies was to act in a way that I believe many of us are scared to. We are scared because it's uncomfortable to talk things out. We're scared because it's inconvenient when people don't do as I say. We're scared because we believe weakness has been our problem for far too long. But I don't believe weakness was our problem. I believe apathy was. Apathy doesn't invite your neighbor to dinner. Apathy does not step across boundary lines and loves on the enemy. Weakness is vulnerable. Weakness lays itself bare. And the weakness Christ calls us to is vulnerable for the sake of others. The weakness Christ calls us to lays itself bare for the life of others. 2 Corinthians 12, 9-11 says, "For my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." We started this conversation off by explaining a bit about the H1B visa program and how in a country claiming it was built on merit is denying the merit from others. The way you take other people's good efforts away from them is by labeling them as garbage or fraudsters. You have to turn them into your enemy. As Christians, this is an area where we desperately need to remember who our allegiance is to first. Our allegiance first is to God, the one who told us to put our merit to the side because it was like filthy rags, as it says in Isaiah 64:6. And instead in grace placed his merit in front of the Father on our behalf so that we might live in a land not our own. The Christian story is an immigrant story, and you may feel like I'm turning Christianity woke, but in reality, you may have just turned Christianity into the empire. Christians don't operate in a binary world. Good and evil are not labels we easily place people into because they are labels we wrestle with ourselves. We're both sinners and sanctified. The pilgrim's journey for a Christian is going from our old life to new life, from the city of destruction to the celestial city as John Bunyan described it. We are kingdom people, and our kingdom is not of this world, which implies we don't operate like the world. We don't buy into the lies of this world. We don't grasp for power like this world does. We don't fight our enemies like this world. People are made in the image of God, whether they come from Somalia or Iraq or the U.S., and how we treat others matters. It's all part of the story God is telling throughout history. Our faith is birthed in the no man's land of wanders from this place to the next, and our approach to this subject should resemble that. That is it for this episode of the Freight Podcast. Thank you guys for listening. I know this was a long one. It was a deep dive. I do plan on doing more of these kind of deep dive type episodes, but just let me know what you think. That always helps me kind of gauge on where people are and how they're feeling about the subject or how we're approaching the subject. Thank you again for listening. Make sure you hit subscribe, rate and review, and share this with your closest friend. See you next time.